You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals.
Welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 88. I'm your host, Sarah Head, with my co-hosts today, Ken Fader and Jeb Card. And today we're talking to special guest, Dr. Mark Allen Peterson from Miami University in Ohio. Today we're talking about Jinn, not the wonderful drink, but the spooky evil spirits that haunt lamps and grant wishes. We talked to Dr. Peterson about the reality of Jinn. What were these creatures? How were they described in the Bible? How were they represented in ancient Egypt? And how are they represented today in modern Arabic cultures? Get ready to think critically.
Are you getting it? Maybe? Digging in a trench.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I am your host, Sarah, and I am joined today with my co-hosts, Ken Fader and Jeb Card. How's it going, guys?
Doing all right. We finally are now getting fall weather that actually looks and feels like fall weather. The never-ending summer is apparently over, knock on wood. And I found out that my book is probably coming out in May, it sounds like, with maybe some preliminary stuff a little earlier than that. So that's what I'm up to.
Yay, exciting. And Ken, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing all right. Like Jeb here in New England, we are finally experiencing something that is similar to fall, and the leaves are starting to change. And it's real pretty weather that we're having. So... and we're looking at midterms coming up pretty quickly. So.
Oh, God,
Don't
yes.
remind me.
Yes, the black pit of midterms.
Yeah, our grades are due in a few days, and yeah.
I'm terrified of the papers I have to write. But anyway, we are joined today with a special guest, Mark Allen Peterson. He is going to be our resident expert on Jinn today, and that's J-I-N.
Not G-I-N.
As an archaeologist, we all just fell over ourselves jumping in to make sure we know we're not talking about the
beverage,
the spirit, but the other spirit. So
very good, Jim. I like
Mark might also be an expert in Jinn.
Well, these
not really.
These ethnographers.
These ethnographers. We're just grabbing them all. They're like Pokemon. We're collecting them.
But Mark, when I mentioned that we're talking about a spirit, not a spirit, is a spirit even a proper term? And has our audience ever even heard of these?
Well, everybody knows what a genie is. Genies are these wish-granting spirits from the Middle East that are trapped in objects, and if you release them from the object, then they grant you wishes, usually 3 wishes. And this is a Western reimagination of a Middle Eastern being called a Jinn, one of the 3 creations of God. God created angels, Jinn, and humans. And like angels, they're magical and they're part of the invisible world. But like humans, they have free will, and they are capable, some of them, of doing extraordinary magical feats. And so they're sort of betwixt and between the supernatural world and the ordinary world. I don't think most people in the Middle East would think of them as spirits always. Sometimes they very clearly have bodies.
Okay.
But other times they can also take possession of you the way that demons are imagined to take possession of you in the West. So
right.
They're sort of betwixt and between spirits and embodied beings as well.
Which sounds a lot like our episode that we did on fairies last year, where they're sort of the people that are betwixt. They're not quite gods. They're not quite angels. They're not quite people.
Yes.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. That was rude.
I was just going to say, fairies are a good analogy for Jinn in many ways. Not entirely, because Jinn also have these very important connections to devils and demons. But in many ways, they're very much like fairies.
So, Mark, what you're telling me is that those of us of a certain age who grew up watching I Dream of Jeannie, and then we took our kids to the Disney movie Aladdin, and so genies are like Robin Williams, that's all a Western creation?
Yeah, and it's especially interesting how that came about, because around the time that in the 18th century, capitalism was really, print capitalism was emerging. We had this series of translations of Alf Layla wa Layla, The Thousand Nights and a Night, which contains a number of stories about genies. And as this came in to the West, Westerners tended to pick up only on a couple of the stories. I mean, there's a story where a man falls in love with and goes through adventures and marries a jinn from under the sea. There are stories about powerful jinn who do all kinds of terrible things. There's jinn who get killed and their relatives seek revenge. But the ones that Westerners tend to focus on were the Aladdin story and the story of the jinn jinn and the fisherman, where he releases a jinn and it's going to destroy him, and he gets it to grant him wishes instead. And so this idea of jinn in objects, a lamp or a ring in Aladdin, or a brass bottle in the case of the fisherman and the jinn, that's what sort of took hold in the Western imagination.
Interesting. That right. Again kind of ties us into our fairy stuff, because I've talked about this. I think that old objects often, if they lose their identity, often get it sort of attributed to these extra humans, these people that are not us. We talked about the Luck of Eden Hall, which is actually a medieval Syrian cup, but it becomes a fairy cup once it loses that identity. And so you're saying the ones that grant wishes tied to objects. I'm actually wondering if there's a little syncretism with fairy traditions when they adopt these particular ones.
Yeah, I think so. I think that in many ways what happened was Europe already had a whole set of mythic characters that inhabited certain kinds of structural positions in the way they told stories. We had fairies, we had ghosts, we had demons and devils. And in the Middle East, jinn can occupy any of those things. They can be tempters that are trying to win your soul away from God. They can be somehow connected with spirits of the dead, or take on both the image and personality of your dead relatives. They can possess you like devils or demons. They can also live in liminal spaces like caves and forest groves and rivers, isolated river valleys, and
abandoned houses often.
Exactly,
right?
Yes. And then they can encounter people and reward them or punish them for their good behavior or bad behavior, as happens in fairy tales.
Along that line, I think one of the interesting traits of the jinn that you brought up, though, is that they are considered creatures of free will on top of all of that. So it's not as if they are compelled to be evil or compelled to be good, even though they're recognized as being one of the creations of God. So I found that to be interesting in how that parallels. They're like superhumans, basically. Like, they're basically humans, but they have these powers.
They're basically humans. They have these powers. There are definitely some jinn who, in the story, seem to be much weaker than others. When you hear the term ifrit, an ifrit of the jinn, an ifrit seems to be a term for power. And so an ifrit is a jinn who has enormous powers. The King Solomon is put in command of ifrits, and he can command an ifrit to take his throne all the way around the world in the blink of an eye, we're told. And so,
do we know how old that story, or like not just the ifrit, but the whole? Can we dive into that a little? The King Solomon story.
Well, I don't know how old it is. It's certainly very well known throughout the Islamic world. King Solomon was given power over the jinn. It was part of that gift of wisdom that both the Bible and the Quran talk about. In the Quran, he's given power over the jinn. He has a seal, the seal of Solomon, which he can use. If in Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1001 Nights, there's a story called the City of Brass, and these people are searching for the City of Brass, where hundreds of these brass bottles that Suleiman put evil jinn and ifrits into and sealed them away are available for people to take. And so they're searching for the city of brass. It's a quest story. But when they get there, it's not what they think. So there's this notion that Suleiman the Great was the greatest of the ancient pre-Muhammad Islam, kings, and he was given these powers by God to command the Ifrits. And many contemporary sorcerers and sorcerers through history in the Middle East have commanded Ifrits and Jinn through the power of the Seal of Solomon. And that's how you build things. So one of the things that you can do is you can build the city of Palmyra. Some people have claimed, some travelers have claimed, was built by Jinn, or the city of Petra, or the Dome of the Rock even. Some people, or the pyramids. People have claimed these were built by Jinn. They're too beautiful, too awesome to have been built by ordinary humans.
Yeah, and we to prepare for this, we read an article by Drieskins and Lucarella that talks about modern Egyptians, or some modern Egyptians talking about, the pharaohs must have been powerful sorcerers. They controlled a number of jinn to basically do their bidding, which is sort of a very different take than the sort of Western ancient aliens perspective.
Right. Well, that's because we know if you live in the Middle East, you live around jinn. You know jinn exist, even if you don't have a direct encounter with them. Most people you know can tell you stories of encounters with jinn. It's rarely they themselves who encountered the jinn. It's usually an uncle or a cousin or someone.
A friend of a friend.
A friend of a friend. I've had students tell me, when I taught at the American University in Cairo, I had students tell me about their uncle's encounter with sorcerers who had control of jinn and who did uncanny things that were inexplicable if jinn don't exist. I had a very interesting dinner with a psychiatrist once who had a degree from American University, and he talked about the challenge of distinguishing between when someone is mentally ill and when they are possessed by a jinn.
And I've seen articles like that as well.
Yeah, and so you have to for the psychiatrist, this is a very important determination, because if they try to treat someone who's possessed of a jinn, not only will be unsuccessful, but all kinds of terrible things can happen to everyone involved. That's got to be turned over to someone who has expertise in getting rid of jinn. Whereas if you take someone who's mentally ill and you turn them over to someone who expels jinn, then you run the risk of making their mental illness worse. So they see this as a real problem.
That sounds very much like you'll hear people talk about, how do you distinguish mental illness from possession?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you call a priest or do you call a psychiatrist, and how do you distinguish those two conditions?
Right.
So that sounds very similar.
Oh, I think
I was hearing actually that there's a branch that still performs exorcisms, and this is of course completely third hand, so feel free to poo-poo it. But apparently one of the things they do first is they make you go through a battery of psychological exams to make sure there's not something psychologically wrong with you that could explain the quote-unquote possession before they perform the exorcism. But they're still willing to perform the exorcism,
Well, sure.
So it's
I've heard that as well, but I probably know more than you do on that.
Yeah, it's something I heard on another podcast. So it has to be factually true.
So, Mark, if people are beset by bad luck, if somebody's car breaks down and there's a perfectly no good reason for it, are jinn presumed to be the culprits of bad luck happening to otherwise good people?
actually more often that's going to be attributed to the evil eye.
Oh, okay.
So if I'm having
that's
a streak
another
of
podcast.
bad luck,
That's another show.
Well,
yeah.
we can
No,
talk
not
about
really,
it a little.
yeah.
I want to hear this.
Yeah,
All right,
what's
so-
the comparison?
well, so they're actually there's absolutely, they have nothing in common. What the evil eye is a kind of magic that we're all capable of doing when we look at someone with envy or with anger, extreme anger. Some people have more of this capacity than others.
None of us have ever done this on this show, ever.
Exactly, of course. and so, not on any of the episodes I've listened to. So what happens is, if I'm miserly, if I own a shop and I'm overly competitive with my fellow shopkeepers, or I go in for ostentatious displays of wealth and I'm spending lots of money on things and I'm not giving to the poor, if I'm behaving in ways that are sort of antisocial, then people will, there will be these social implications, and one of them is that will happen to me is the evil eye. People are looking at me with envy, with anger, with mistrust, and this has physical effects. Other people are believed to just have the evil eye in a kind of sorcerous way. There's certain people who just, you want to avoid, they're just always angry, and maybe they're possessed of a jinn, so you could get the jinn in here that way. And so their glances, even if they're unjust, could still affect you. But for the most part, you try to ward them off with amulets. Almost everyone I know, there are blue amulets, blue and brass amulets that you can get anywhere in the Middle East. Any shop, there's any marketplace you go to, there's somebody selling these. I have one in my office. And when but one of the most fascinating things is mirrors, historically, could chase away the evil eye. You could sort of reflect the evil eye back at people.
Oh, all right.
So taxi drivers in Cairo started hanging old CD-ROMs from their rearview mirrors, because these things spin around and they're perfect mirrors on one side.
Well, that's fascinating, because that was a big thing in, I want to say especially the 90s and early 2000s in El Salvador, and I don't know why. And I've asked people, and I've heard things like, oh, they got sent back by relatives in the States and they didn't have anything to do with them. I honestly have no idea, but the CDs hanging from the rear view mirror, like the central rear view mirror inside the car, was a huge thing in El Salvador. I haven't seen it as much recently.
That's interesting.
Well, in the Middle East, it's reflecting the evil eye. It's warding off.
Do they still do it today? Is that still a practice today? Or because I know I've seen it here in the States occasionally, but not, like Jeb was saying, since maybe the late 90s, early 2000s?
I was the last time, let's see, in 2000, I know they were still doing it in 2010.
Well, there you go.
Okay.
So fairly recently.
That's fair enough.
The other thing you mentioned was blue glass amulets, and I think I've seen some of the ones you have, actually.
Yeah.
Do you have any knowledge as to why blue and glass? I have a reason for asking.
I don't. I know that blue is sort of universally around the Mediterranean. I mean, you'll meet Greeks and people from the French coast on the Mediterranean who also believe in the evil eye and who also make use of
blue glass amulets.
Blue glass beads. Blue porcelain is okay. If you have porcelain, you paint it a shiny blue. There's particular things. Eyes are especially valuable. There's a particular figure called the Hand of Fatima, which is the name of God written in such a way that the letters of God's name, Allah, form fingers. And so the Hand of Fatima is one of the preferred amulets. So there's a number of these.
Well, it just puts in mind, maybe because I was teaching this today, blue glass faience amulets from Egypt.
Yeah, there's no reason not to believe that it goes back that far.
I mean, I'd like to see something connective, but it just reminds me of it.
Can you explain what that is real quick, Jeb? Because I don't think everybody's aware.
So in classical Egypt, but I think throughout like Pharaonic Egypt, but especially in the later period when you have, the Ptolemaic and the Greeks, and then the larger Hellenistic, and then after, you have people, and Mark, feel free to jump in if I say anything stupid here. You have amulets with various symbols, many of them sort of icons of various deities. The most famous one, you've all seen this, the sort of Egyptian eye is, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, the Wedjot. It's the sort of the eye of the sun and eye of Horus, and it is a protective symbol. And while they can be made of various things, the most common thing you see these things in is a blue faience, which is it's kind of like, I think it's called frit. It's a glass, but it's not translucent.
Right. I think most Egyptians would be willing to believe that there's a continuity, because they tend to, my friends anyway would tend to say that the ancient Egyptians were doing the same things. They were pagans, so they consorted with jinn in ways that contemporary Muslims aren't supposed to, but they had to ward off the evil eye, just like contemporary people do. They had to deal with sorcery and the enslavement of jinn and the potential of possession by jinn. So where the explanation of the eye I have heard is never that it's historically related to the eye of Ra, because that would make it haram and you couldn't use it. So the contemporary explanation is, you're making an image of an eye because you're warding off the evil eye. It's, old-fashioned golden bow Fraser,
sympathetic magic.
Kinds of magic. Yeah, sympathetic magic.
That's really great. Let's go to break real quick, and when we come back, I want to talk about this intersection of ancient Egyptian faith, archaeology, and Jinn.
This network is supported by our listeners. You can become a supporting member by going to arcpodnet.com/members and signing up. As a supporting member, you have access to high-quality downloads of each show and a discount at our future online store, and access to show hosts on a members-only Slack team. For professional members, we'll have training shows and other special content offered throughout the year. Once again, go to arcpodnet.com/members to support the network and get some great extras and swag in the process. That's arcpodnet.com/members.
If you're a facilities manager at a warehouse and your HVAC system goes down, it can turn up the heat, literally. But don't sweat it, Grainger has you covered. Grainger offers over 1 million industrial-grade products for all your operations, including warehouse HVAC maintenance. And even better, they offer access to experts and fast delivery, so you and your warehouse can both keep your cool. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Everyone, and we are back, and we are still talking with Mark Allen Peterson, and I really wanted to talk about the article that Jeb sent us to prepare us for this podcast. And it's the Untying the Magic of the Pharaoh, and it's Barbara Dreiskin and Rita Lucarelli.
Like Dreiskin's and Lucarelli, something like that. I don't know them, so.
I apologize if I mispronounced your names, but it's a really great article. And I want to touch on specifically the concept of the sheikhs and their use of their personal jinn to locate archaeological sites and then clear those sites of evil jinn or evil spirits so that those sites are safe for looting. Not because I want to talk about the looting, but it sounds very much like psychic archaeology, something that we've talked about on the show before. And just the concept of using them as like bloodhounds is kind of a neat concept.
I mean, can you even call them evil if their job is to protect these tombs from looting?
Excellent point.
They're not really evil.
Excellent point.
And can we actually start with the definition of sheikh? Because honestly, for me, before looking into this a few years ago, I just thought it meant like local important person or something like that. Yeah.
In many ways, it does. And if I have control of a jinn, I'm a local important person.
That's fair.
A sheikh can be the person who leads prayer at a mosque. A sheikh can be a local authority in a village. It can be a tribal authority within a lineage.
And that's how I often would have thought of it. Yeah.
But if if I have control of a jinn, sheikh is going to be a title people are going to give me. And I would emphasize here too that on this notion of good and evil. good jinn are jinn that choose to follow God, and bad jinn are jinn who choose to not follow God. All of these jinn involved in finding treasures and guarding treasures are enslaved. So someone through sorcery has enslaved a jinn to be a guardian spirit of their tomb. So if I'm a pharaoh and I have command of, if not command of jinn, I have command of people who have command of jinn, then I'm going to get a jinn to guard my tomb. And if I'm a sheikh who can take control of jinn, then I can use that to combat those jinn. And if I'm a grave robber, the last thing I want to do is face a supernatural menace if I don't have something supernatural to fight it with.
Right.
Yeah, that's a pretty cross-cultural pro tip there. Just never do that.
Yeah, don't. That's Laura Croft is she needs a jinn.
Yeah.
Okay. Aside from that, and
I killed that conversation.
Leaving it there like that in a while.
Well, honestly, one of the reasons is I'm trying to hold back and not say, hey, this sounds just like, and then say fairies again. But I literally have.
But it does sound like the fairies thing, though. I mean,
it does. I have literally a reproduction of a grimoire about how to do exactly this, how to basically get fairies and spirits, because they're considered the same thing, and demons all together under your control to do things. And of course, if we have the genie from the Jinn, the modern version of that would be the leprechaun. Catch the leprechaun. He has to give you, 3 wishes because you've stolen his pot of gold or something like that, which sounds awfully familiar. One thing so we mentioned the Jurassicans and Lucarella, and I think that's fascinating because they did a study of how people have seen it in the past and the present. Mark, what is the name of, and where can our listeners find? We can repeat this at the end, but the article that you were working on, you worked on, you mentioned the sort of Jinn to Genie.
So I have an article called From Jinn to Genies. It's in a book called Folklore Cinema, edited by Sharon Sherman and Michael Coven.
Okay. And I think it's actually available online. It's part of, not the Haditha, but there's the other, the one that makes a lot of things available online. Because I went and found a scanned copy, or you gave me one, but then we found it online, like a much cleaner one. So we should be able to put that in the show notes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Utah State University at some point made the book available online in its entirety.
Yeah, no, and so we should definitely read that. And you talked about in that a number of more obscure to, I think, Western audiences, but movies that sort of combine the two that are in the Middle East, in the area where jinn are very prevalent, but have elements also of the Western kind of transformation to the genie as well.
Yeah. So one of the things that fascinates me, so historically, jinn probably were spirits of location prior to Islam. And they were clearly so well understood by Arabs that when Muhammad had his revelation and issued the Quran, spoke the Quran, the jinn are in there. Taken for granted that there's these 3 kinds of beings.
So this is not being introduced to that, but what do you mean by spirit of location? I think I know, but could you spell that out a little?
Well, so throughout the Mediterranean, you had these in ancient Greek myth and Roman myth and Etruscan and Asia Minor. You had little gods of places. Okay. The god of the grove, the god of the rocks, the god of the forest, the god of this cave. And people would make
specific places.
Specific places, and people would do little propitiatory things so that terrible things wouldn't happen. And then if you built nearby, people had to propitiate these gods. And there's evidence that the ancient Egyptians believed in these little gods. They seem to be very widespread throughout ancient Mediterranean lore, and so one theory is that this is what jinn were prior to their being sort of canonized in Islam and explained by Muhammad as where they actually fit in.
Right.
Between angels, which are made of light, and humans who are made of clay, we have the jinn who are made of smokeless fire.
So instead of rejecting this as superstition of ancient people, there's no, those things are real, but we know what they are, and they are jinn.
Exactly. And if you think about that, that's a very powerful way to missionize. Because you can
absolutely.
say, look, your ancestors weren't wrong.
Right.
They just didn't really know what they were doing. And, they're putting their worship in the wrong direction. But they weren't crazy or deluded or foolish.
Right.
And we see a lot of that today.
Right. And I also think it's interesting to borrow a page out of Jeb's book, that whole idea of them being specific to an area. There are many fairies that are tied to a specific area or a specific thing. So, I mean, can I ask the question of, do you have an idea as to why there seems to be so much of an overlap, or do you think it's just a coincidence?
I think that fairies are a reworking in the medieval imagination of these same kinds of ancient propitiatory deities of place, and they get reworked in the popular imagination. They absorb a lot of things, and I think the same thing is true of jinn. Jinn absorb a lot of things. I mean, there are other supernatural creatures that people will talk about, like ghouls.
And now they're not related to jinn.
Well, this is the trick. Yes and no. If you start to try to pin someone down, since ghouls aren't mentioned in the Quran or the Hadith, they seem to be a kind of jinn, and so the boundaries of these things get very vague from one story to another.
Yeah, and that's not super surprising. One of the things I think a lot of people that come from a background that's not a true believer, and they try to grapple with a lot of stuff we talk about that in the show, they'll often try to create a taxonomy or try to create, I mean, I remember doing this, and then you quickly realize it's a terrible, terrible decision, because that's just not how this works. Let me kind of riff off of something you were mentioning. So you suggested that it's the same sort of these new traditions coming in and dealing with spirits of place, gods of place, in essence, an enchanted landscape. Is this sort of maybe the tension between a more universalist worldview and religion that is not tied to landscape, is much broader in its cosmology, versus, again, I'm thinking of Christianity entering an area where it has all these traditions, but is more associated with personal salvation, a word from outside, not necessarily as local. Is it that kind of a dynamic, maybe?
Oh yeah, absolutely. One of the things that happens is we go from, with Islam, we go from a group of people who are worshiping tutelary deities, tribal deities, deities of place, to a universal monotheism that is, at least theoretically, binding on all people at all times.
Right.
And so at that, and the jinn are fascinating because they become incorporated into this. One of the things that is very interesting to me is that in Islamic lore, the devil, Iblis, and the devils, the shaitan, are not fallen angels, they're fallen jinn.
Huh.
Interesting.
Angels can't fall. Angels are in perfect accord with God. So they don't have free will, so they can't fall.
Oh, sure, right.
Yeah, good point. So they don't acknowledge the, I guess it's a Gnostic text, where there was the battle in heaven and a third of the angels fell, or no one else.
Yeah, that's not
a thing for them?
That's there in some rabbinical traditions. It's there in some of the Gnostic texts, but it's not an Islamic. It's not something that Islam has incorporated into its story.
That's interesting.
They don't need that. There is a time at the beginning and this actually parallels a different rabbinic text, where God creates Adam out of clay, and he asks the angels and jinn to bow to Adam, his new creation. And the angels do so because they're in perfect accord with God's will. And Iblis, who is to the jinn what Adam was to humans,
Right.
refuses to bow because he's made of fire, smokeless fire at that, and this thing is made of clay. And so, again, it's out of his pride. He then cuts himself off from God. And his goal is sort of to prove himself right by seducing humans away from God, and thus proving to God that he was right all along. These people are unworthy of him.
So he's kind of a Lucifer figure.
He's very much a Lucifer figure.
Very interesting.
And then it also reflects the free will
Right.
that these beings have, having the ability to say no to God.
Right. Exactly. And you have to have that ability to say no to God. That's the essence of free will. And the shaitans are the jinn who have turned away from God, as opposed to jinn who have who follow God. And then you've got you can have afrits from either group. You can have jinn shaitans that don't seem to have very much power. They just kind of whisper at you. And then you can have jinn, shaitans that are haunt your house and do terrible things to you and have to be cast out by a sheikh or a czar practitioner.
So, I mean, I have to ask this question because we're talking about they can either, follow God or reject God. Are there atheist jinn?
That's a good question. There are many jinn stories where the question of whether you're good or not doesn't come up, except that usually they will at least use phrases. And this is one of the things that's fascinating. Now, Layla, all the jinn are sort of very cosmopolitan, and if you release them, the first thing they'll do is praise God. But they don't always act good. So they may say the right phrases, but they're not always they're clearly not always doing God's will. And so in that sense too, they're like humans.
I think that's very interesting, the whole concept of this, the human-esque jinn. I think it's not something that you really see. I feel like it's not something that you really see in other kind of religious fairy tales, for lack of a better term, where it's, they're either evil or they're good. They're very rarely ambiguous like this, even though there's a lot of parallels between the jinn and the fae. Again, the fae are usually split into Seelie and unseelie.
Well, they in some traditions they are. In others, they are actually the middle ground you're looking for. When you mentioned the third thrown out, one explanation for fairies and fae is it's basically they're the ones that were sort of, I'm not certain about this, and then they get tossed out. And they're often they're trickstery, so they're more good and bad, but not like really aligning either way. Whereas Mark is really talking about something where it's like people, some are really over here and some are really over here and some are sort of in the middle. Whereas generally with fairies and fae versus straight up demons, a lot of them are just in the middle.
Right. And they don't really pretend to not be.
Mm-hmm.
No, not much, except for maybe to screw with you.
Right, exactly.
Right. And you were talking about movies earlier, and in some Middle Eastern movies about jinn, there are very real issues with, are they good or are they bad? There's a jinn film that's very much about jinn, not genies, in which a jinn falls in love with a woman, and he haunts her home, and he is trying to he wants her to fall in love and marry him. There's a Quranic or an admonition in the Hadith that says that you should not humans should not marry jinn, and she is trying to abide by that, although she finds herself attracted to him. He is trying to seduce her, and he's got these evil, shaitanic members of his family who are telling him to just take her, but he wants love, and so he occupies this very interstitial category as he haunts her home.
Well, you had mentioned incubus and succubus earlier. Is there any of that sort of nocturnal assault tradition, which the whole gets tied into the Mara, the nightmare, the sleep paralysis sort of thing, with Jinn?
Yes, not as dramatic as something like an incubus or succubus, but there's certainly the idea that Jinn can haunt your home.
Okay.
And they can do it for any number of reasons. They can do it because you've committed some grave sin and that's made an opening for them to be able to enter. But some people believe that Jinn can just come into especially interstitial spaces, liminal spaces in your home, like the basement or the bathroom.
Well, that's
I saw
horrifying.
that. That was really...
Yeah, no, I want no part of that. None.
Well,
I love that people
And so
say
there's-
prayers before going into their bathroom. I mean, there is a lot you can say
Yes.
about that. Most of it has to do with the can of
that-
spray afterwards.
Or, I was about to say, my bathroom, that's an entirely rational behavior.
or you can just put a little Quranic verse above your bathroom and just touch it before you enter.
Right.
Huh.
And that has the same effect.
I just love that it's the bathroom that is the evil room in the house. I mean, that just tickles me on a very childish level.
It's not evil. It's liminal. It's marginal. It's not really a living space, but it's in your living
That's
space.
a fairly good point.
Little bit of the Mary Douglas there.
So yeah, exactly. I think that's a huge part of Jinn. Jinn are betwixt and between.
Right.
They're betwixt and between good and evil. They're betwixt and between the invisible and visible world. They occupy places that are betwixt and between. Basements aren't really part of your house, but they are.
Yeah.
Bathrooms are set aside for one particular purpose. You don't live in the bathroom.
Right.
You go in there and you come back
I
out.
mean, maybe
and
you don't
so
live
there's
in
a
the
kind of
bathroom, but...
well,
We're not.
my
we're not-
teenagers did.
We're not getting into people's diet, people's other bodily functions, whatevs. We're not doing that right now.
But even in modern Western horror stories, the basement is a
Oh,
scary
yeah.
place.
Oh yeah, you never
No,
go in the
you
basement.
never go in the basement.
Never go in the basement.
That's
no,
where
no.
the weird noises and
I
go down.
am not gonna
People-
lie to
the
you.
People in horror movies who
I lived in a house for 2 years, and it was one of those great, tail end of the Victorian era shotgun run. It was
Oh
a beautiful house. I would not set foot in that basement, and that's where the washer and dryer was. I was like, I will go to a laundromat. I'm not going in that basement. No.
there are all these underworld vibes, and it's not quite my house, and it tends to be darker and danker, and there are no
It was
windows.
a terrifying place.
so-
There are dead things in that basement. I am not going down there anyway.
There was a friend of mine who recently moved out of a place, but before he did, there were all these bizarre, locked up, nailed up drawers, dozens of them, which this individual who's not an archaeologist just took a picture. He's like, they must be metal drawers, and I get down, I start touching things because archaeologists touch
Yes,
things.
true.
These are wood. We're totally breaking into these. And we actually found a Friday the 13th grocery supplement, like a sale thing, and I was able to figure out, based on it being a Friday the 13th and sort of the style and
Year it
prices of
was,
the ads,
yeah.
what year it was. And then, of course, I just then went and looked on Zillow and found out when the damn house was built, because screw your detective work. But it had been in there from the month they built it, which was actually pretty awesome. But yeah, no, that house also had somebody's name written in red. It wasn't blood. It wasn't, and a ring in the fireplace. No, something horrible happened there. That's all I'm saying. That's all.
Yeah, really bad interior
Yeah,
decoration.
right.
Yeah, or it just needs to be blessed by a priest and then fold in up on itself.
Yeah,
One
fold
or
it
the
up on
other.
And almost certainly, as we will deal with, I think, on the podcast before Halloween, it was built on the site of an Indian burial
Oh, my
ground.
Lord.
It had to be.
Well,
Hypothetically.
the funny thing is,
Funny story.
given the part of town it's in, I'm not saying any more, but you may not be wrong. So anywho.
just don't go into the
Asylum.
light.
It also could be an asylum. It might not an Indian burial ground. It could be an asylum.
Well, why don't we go to break?
Yes.
And when we come back, I have one or two things I want to ask about, and one of these does tie into archaeology, and the other does tie into crazy, crazy bullshit. So it's eminently perfect for this show.
We always get there. It may be circuitous, but we always get to the crazy bullshit.
Yes.
I'm Jessica Yaquinto, and I'm the host of the Heritage Voices podcast. Heritage Voices focuses on how CRM and heritage professionals, public employees, tribes, and descendant communities can best work together to protect their heritage through tribal consultation, collaborative ethnography, and indigenous archaeology. Now back to the show.
And we are back, and we are still talking with Mark Allen Peterson. And Jeb, you have a funny story you want to tell us.
Well, I have a couple of questions for Mark, but before I do, I just wanted to mention I recently went and spoke to a very great audience at the Miami Valley Astronomical Society in Dayton about the kinds of things we talk about on this show. And there was a great question and answer, lots of great questions and answers afterwards. And one of the questions was, have you ever heard of the Mandela effect? And I had to calm myself and go, I'm a co-host on the show Archaeological Fantasies, and if you go look up our cryptozoology episode, there's a rant that has become somewhat infamous about the Mandela effect, and you all were there, so I just won't say any more. I just thought you might find that amusing. Anyway, back to our topic on hand. Mark, I wanted to ask, so we've been talking about this sort of liminal and how Jinn are sort of between kind of like God and angels and humans, and they're sort of interstitial, and they show up in interstitial places. And in the book I won't mention the name of again, I've been discussing, and we did this on our fairies episode, about the idea that around the world, and I do kind of lump Jinn in on this, when you have archaeological things, ruins, but also other things that don't necessarily have an identity of recent building, these things often get attributed to extra humans, to people that are not human, but very human-like. And again, I think that applies to the Jinn, as we've been talking about. We've been talking about ruins, we've talked about pyramids, haunted houses, the temple, all these sorts of things. We've also mentioned the Seal of Solomon. And I know there's this idea, and you sort of alluded to this, and this gets very much in the Western tradition, of objects that can trap Jinn and whatnot. But are there, I'd like to talk about that a little, but before we do, are there any like archaeological or other kinds of objects that get attributed to Jinn that are not big buildings?
They can. I mean, sometimes grottos or particular caves will be said to have been, they're not natural, they were created by Jinn.
Okay.
But mostly it's monumental things that it's inconceivable that humans could have raised these vast things, so it must have been Jinn. Yeah. Although I've also, someone was telling me about a spring, and that essentially someone had bound, maybe Solomon, had bound Jinn to pump eternally. And so the reason this spring continues to operate is because there's these poor Jinn trapped down there who apparently are not effreet. They're stuck with, sort of normal human strength. And so they're just operating this pump manually for eternity. Very unpleasant job. So, and what that captures is the fact that, for Middle Eastern sorcery and magic, much of it is done through the enslavement of Jinn. And the tying of knots is a particular, within incantations and so on, is a particular kind of magic that's done to control Jinn. So they can be somehow captured or dealt with through the tying of complex knots. There's a understanding that Jinn can be captured and trapped in rings or other vessels, bound to them in some way, and then you can control them accordingly. And you can go online and you can buy rings.
Well, in the article, they were talking about how there were, I want to say this is pronounced Sikh, which kind of threw me because as I understand Sikhs, I don't know anything about Sikhs, but they don't do this. But anyway, they're basically, they sound like shaman who have a companion Jinn that they then employ to go help them find archaeological sites, and then when they find the site, they use that Jinn and magic to combat the guardian Jinn that are there, or the guardian spirits that are there, and then clear out all the magic and all the evil Jinn so that the guys can go and loot the site.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, if I'm a pharaoh, I'm going to bind Jinn to guard my tomb. And if I'm a tomb robber, I'm not going to go face a supernatural foe unless I have some kind of a weapon to face that supernatural foe with.
Right.
We absolutely should be talking about this in the podcast.
Yeah, I want to find the word so I can spell it so that I don't sound like a total
it looked like chic or something like
that.
It
looked like chic, but I'm just like, there's no way it's pronounced chic.
Sheikh.
So
it's sheikh, and the thing is, a sheikh can mean a lot of things in different. In ordinary, I mean, it can be a person of authority in a Bedouin tribe. It can be the person who leads the prayer at a mosque. It can be a local person of authority in a small village community. Anyone who has who commands certain kinds of authorities can be called a sheikh.
Oh, okay. So it is a sheikh, all right.
Yeah, and if I have a Jinn, people are going to call me a sheikh.
And that's what they were saying in the article here. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got the authority to command a Jinn. I'm a sheikh.
Fair enough.
So, all right. I the question, and I'd like to ask it on the podcast is: so the Jinn are not. There's not a taxonomy of discrete categories of different kinds of Jinn, or is there?
Okay, well, so I was deeply misled by Dungeons and Dragons when I was a kid.
Okay, that's of course the line I jumped back in on.
Because
and we will talk about this intersection in the podcast.
There's a very clear they do have Jinn, and they have this very clear sort of genealogy, and they tie them to elements.
If I was Blake Smith, I would have said a genealogy, but I'm not Blake Smith.
I'm glad you're not Blake Smith. And yet somehow you managed to get it in there.
Yeah.
No, there really isn't a classic typology. In fact, it gets really weird when you start talking about ghosts, because when people want to talk about a ghost, they'll use the term jinn or ifrit. So there's a movie, an Egyptian movie, and it uses the word jinn, but it's very clear in the movie that this jinn is actually the ghost of the man's first wife.
Okay.
And she keeps interfering with his life.
I want to watch half of these movies you described in your article now, though. I went to look up the one. I typed in the Arabic name, and my computer was like, no. And then I realized it's translated as talisman, and I'm like, okay, I'll look that up later. But yeah, I want to see that one now.
You can't find these. That's a real problem. I had a grad student who took my daughter and I in 2005 into this part of town, a fairly a working class part of town, where they had these studios where they made copies of old movies, and they moved them from film to videotape to CDs, which is also where I bought all of the still photos. And it was I don't know, we went there like 10 o'clock at night in order to be able to meet people. And I still don't completely understand what was going on, but it was great. And I managed to get hold of, they sat there literally and found videotapes and gave me tea while they ran prints, digitalized and ran prints of these old movies.
Oh, wow.
So it's a bootlegging operation.
Yes and no. It's in many cases, for some of these older movies, it's not clear who has title anymore.
Oh, yeah.
But it's a way of preserving them, so, we'll go with that story.
Funny bitty blokes you will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
We'd like to thank Dr. Peterson for coming onto the show with us. Check the show notes for more information on Dr. Peterson's research and other fun articles about Jinn in the media and in modern culture. We apologize for the slight technical difficulty there at the end, but we hope everyone enjoyed the show, and if you have any questions, you can always contact us at archaefantasies@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.
Roundhouses and Romans, human evolution makes us smile.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archaefantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaefantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archaefantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at archaefantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaefantasies. Thanks again for listening.
We don't do dinosaurs.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
See? Are you happy? Do you get it now? Do you get it?
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.